Here's Johnny.
Amid all the celebrities that graced the Tonight Show stage, a young biologist captured the attention of the king of late night.
And his book called The Population Bomb has sold over 2 million copies. And his appearances on this show have probably drawn more audience response than anyone else we have had on. Would you welcome Dr. Paul Ehrlich?
Between 1970 and 1981, Paul Ehrlich sat in the coveted chair next to Johnny at least 25 times. But for a show known for its zany comedy sketches and gags, he wasn't the least bit funny.
There's 3.6 billion people in the world today, and we're adding about 70 million a year, and that's too many.
I was afraid that we were going to have more and more people hungry, more and more people struggling over scarce resources. It was easy to see in those days that we were wrecking the environment and doing it faster and faster.
The very delicate life support systems of the planet, the things that supply us with all of our food, ultimately with all of our oxygen, with all of our waste disposal, are now severely threatened.
Ehrlich seemed to be speaking to and for and about the largest generation the U.S. had ever known, the baby boomers.
The country as a whole was like, how are we going to handle all these people?
Roy Beck was one of the nation's first environmental reporters.
We mainly felt it in the schools.
Classes doubled up.
And then it was transportation, because all of us baby boomers started driving. We saw the suburbs developing. We saw land being changed from natural habitat.
The news and television documentaries like this one were filled with stories about the toll too many people were taking on the planet, at home and abroad, where horrible famines in China and India had killed millions. For environmentalists back then, the health of the planet was inextricably tied to the size of its population.
Most of the leaders of the environmental movement made it clear that we could not have a sustainable society unless we began to stabilize our population.
The future is in our hands.
Activists fanned out across the country to spread the message.
Now, if all of us are just willing to pledge to have no more than 2 children, then within 5 years, the population growth curve will begin to drop.
Well, I think that voluntary sterilization is an exceedingly important tool in helping to control the population for a number.
But no one made the case quite like Paul Ehrlich. In the months following the release of The Population Bomb, Ehrlich helped found Zero Population Growth, or ZPG. The group quickly grew to 35,000 members and nearly 400 chapters coast to coast.
Within a couple of years, Zero Population Growth had a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., had a D.C. office, and they were starting to wear ties and try to lobby the government to adopt an official U.S. policy of population stabilization.
Not that Washington had been ignoring the issue. Several years earlier, Lyndon Johnson, as part of his war on poverty, became the first president to use federal money to subsidize birth control.
Part of the war on poverty was efforts to provide family planning and contraception to poor Americans.
This is a public health clinic in Chicago that provides birth control information and devices.
The idea was, of course, that if a poor American family has too many babies, they can't get out of poverty.
But it wasn't just the war on poverty at home. Johnson pushed Congress to aid similar efforts overseas.
I will seek new ways to use our knowledge to help deal with the explosion in world population.
Our cities are going to be choked with people. They're going to be choked with traffic. They're going to be choked with crime.
By the time the 1968 election was in full swing, overpopulation and its effect on the environment had a place on the platforms of both parties.
Nixon, when he took office, wanted to get out ahead of the environmental issue. He perceived that the Democrats were winning on it, but he believed he could match them. He could make it a winning issue for him.
Clean air, clean water, open spaces, these should once again be the birthright of every American.
He was a clever politician, and he knew a lot of people in the country were very much concerned with the environment.
A measure of that concern? In 1970, over 20 million people gathered in their local communities, both large and small, to commemorate the nation's very first Earth Day.
All of the leaders of that first Earth Day in 1970 made it clear that while we have to reduce the per capita impact, that in the end, we had to stabilize the population. We could not continue to keep adding to the multiplier.
As I sign this piece of legislation, it is only a beginning.
It was a new green era. President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, and he pushed through sweeping new environmental laws, including the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Endangered Species Act.
Good morning, Mr. President.
He also established the National Commission on Population Growth and the American Future.
It approaches the problem in terms of trying to find out what we can expect in the way of population growth, where that population will move, and then how we can properly deal with it.
Activists thought they were on the way to the national population policy they'd been dreaming of. Not everyone shared their enthusiasm, however.
Of course, no movement has success without a counter movement developing.
Conservatives and libertarians were railing against the population growth movement. They were insisting that economic growth was dependent upon population growth.
The business community, for example, was totally caught off guard by the environmental movement.
For the business community, it was simple. A growing population meant a growing economy and a growing bottom line. But that's not what President Nixon's Population Commission concluded.
They studied this issue for about 2 years, came out with a report, and they said they could find no aspect of American society that would be improved by further population growth.
By then, other groups were pushing back. In 1968, the Pope warned Catholics that the use of the pill and all other forms of birth control violated church teachings.
What became known as the pro-life community considered any effort to regulate population anathema. So we're starting to see politicization of the issue.
Between the emerging anti-abortion movement and the business lobby, the population issue quickly became a political minefield for the president.
In fact, prior to the commission's final report, Nixon had clearly turned against the commission. Essentially, he ignored the findings of the commission, had him sit down in the Oval Office for 5 minutes, took some photographs, and that was the end of the commission.
And it disappeared without a trace. Just always remember, presidential commissions, whatever they're on, are a way that politicians absolve themselves of any responsibility for doing anything sensible.
It was the last time Mr. Nixon, or any U.S. president, would ever look at America's environment through the lens of domestic population growth. The link was broken. And even though the U.S. continued to grow faster than any other industrialized nation, it wasn't long before the P word would disappear from the environmental movement's agenda as well. Charges that Washington's support of birth control was ultimately a racist policy came from within the African American community.
Many male minority leaders in the late 1960s suggested that population control programs were genocidal.
We have to let our people know that they're coming to get us, and we've got to try to stop them.
And this is one of the major reasons why many on the left, many liberals, turned against the population issues, because of this taint of racial coercion.
Meanwhile, another polarizing issue. Changes to immigration laws had doubled and would soon triple the number of people immigrating to America.
An allegiance to the same.
The population explosion was no longer about new babies. It was now about new immigrants.
So, at that point, population growth is upsetting people on the right because of abortion, people on the left because of immigration.
Culture wars are going to emerge, and all of a sudden population is going to be swept up in the culture wars and incredibly politicized.
Virtually every environmental group pushed population farther and farther to the edge, and they just left population for somebody else to do. But in the end, there was really almost like nobody else to do it.